been a long day.
It's your last.
Alright.
Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 Finale Credits Scene Explained. Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1, Episode 8, included a fast credits scene following the cliffhanger ending of the Amazon Prime Video adaptation. In the Mr. and Mrs. Smith show, Donald Glover plays John Smith with a bloodied shirt, and Maya Erskine plays Jane Smith. Warning: this page includes spoilers for Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 finale. Summary: Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 concludes on a cliffhanger regarding the fate of John and Jane, leaving their survival uncertain. In the finale's mid-credits sequence, Paul Dano's character discovers John and Jane's house in disarray and informs his colleague about the possibilities of selling it. The credits screen does not reveal whether John and Jane are alive or dead, keeping viewers guessing about their destiny. Season 1 of Amazon's Mr. and Mrs. Smith did not conclude with the finale's climactic shooting, as a brief credits sequence expands on one character's twist. Inspired by the 2005 film of the same name starring Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, Amazon's Mr. and Mrs. Smith depicts two spies who work as a married couple under the names John and Jane Smith. Season 1 not only follows the couple on different spy missions with death-defying tasks, but it also serves as a romantic comedy drama that rests on the pair's chemistry and secrets until the end. Unlike the 2005 film, Mr. and Mr. Smith Season 1 concludes on a big cliffhanger about the fates of John and Jane. After another pair of Smiths, Parker Posey and Wagner Murrah, are discovered to be entrusted with killing Jane and John, the spy couples engage in a horrific shootout in their home, the outcome of which is not shown on screen. While bullets are heard, it is unknown who was hit and how many survived. However, despite a mid-credits sequence in Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1, Episode 8, their fates remain uncertain. Donald Glover and Maya Erskine are compared to Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie in Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Exclusive header: Paul Dano's character discovers John and Jane's house is a disaster and prepares to sell it in the middle of the credits scene. In the end of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Paul Dano plays Harris, who is being held at gunpoint by Donald Glover as John. Just after the first end credits, Mr. and Mrs. Smith switch to Paul Dano, who plays the couple's neighbor, knocking on their door and letting himself in. Dano's character claims that he has a book for Jane, only to discover that no one is home and the house is in disarray. Dano quickly calls his colleague Seth and tells him that the firm that owns John and Jane's house is likely ready to sell the flat. Rather than confirming John and Jane's fates, Mr. and Mrs. Smith's credits scene extends a joke about Dano's character. Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 is now available to watch on Amazon Prime Video. This mid-credits scene is a subtle nod to an earlier incident in Mr. and Mrs. Smith Episode 8, when John confronted the neighbor for being suspicious and interested in Jane. Given Paul Dano's successful film and television portrayals of villains, it was expected that he would play a similar character in the spy drama. However, Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 revealed a smart meta twist in which Dano's character is only trying to connect with Jane to get a look at their flat because he works in real estate and wants to sell it. Are John and Jane dead in Mr. and Mrs. Smith's mid-credits scene? The Mrs. and Mrs. Smith show stars Maya Erskine as Jane and Donald Glover as John. Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 1 conclusion does not reveal whether John, aka Michael, and Jane, aka Alana, are still alive. John was shot in the stomach and bleeding out in the panic room, forcing Jane to engage in a one-on-one gunfight with Parker Posey's spy from within the restricted confines. It's unknown whether the several shots hit the same individual or if any were missed, and the house's eerie silence in the mid-credits sequence provides no hints. While the house may be silent and in disarray because John and Jane escaped and fled, it is also possible that the two Smith couples are dead in Mr. and Mrs. Smith's credits scene. The credits scene also does not act as a setup for a future Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2, instead hinting at the Smiths' house coming on the market. However, if Amazon decides to renew Season 2, it is safe to assume that John and Jane survived, fled the house, and are on the run from here. Thank you for watching.